So far, we've discussed concepts that have always been a part of strategic selling. Before we end this discussion of buying influences, though, I wanted to turn briefly to a new concept, an enhancement of what we added to the process only a year or so ago. This is part of what makes the new strategic selling new. I'm speaking about degree of influence. Why don't you explain why we felt it was necessary to add this enhancement?
One of the difficulties of teaching a concept like buying influences is that no matter how hard you try, people get a mindset for relative degree of importance. And what that mindset looks like is the economic buying influence is the most important, therefore that person must have the greatest degree of influence in the sale. The second most important buying influence is the user buying influence, therefore they come next. And then down there somewhere is this lowly technical buying influence who probably doesn't have much impact on the sale at all. And by the way, we'll find a coach who will help to verify this. In reality, the reason that you need to cover all the bases and to identify all the buying influences is that for each sale, you have to determine who has the greatest and the least amount of influence. And it may not be the same even in a sale that looks identical to one that you made a few months ago.
What conditions might cause a user buyer to have a high degree of influence?
For example, a particular user buying influence might see that this particular decision, the sale that you're trying to make, can have a huge amount of impact on this person's job responsibility, opportunity for promotion, maybe freeing this person's time up to do other things. And as an individual, this buying influence sees the importance of your sale as much greater than any other buying influence and is almost desperate to make it happen. If this were the case, then regardless of who played the other roles, it's likely that this person would have a greater degree of influence. Not necessarily, but it's likely that that would be the case.
And I'm also curious, since we spent a lot of time talking about the economic buying influence, what conditions might make an economic buying influence have a low degree of influence?
The low degree of influence is an area in which the economic buying influence has a great deal of confidence in people to whom he or she has delegated the responsibility, is not concerned so much about the outcome, and is focused on other issues, and that the decision is made, in effect, by other buying influences. Not that the economic buying influence couldn't stop it or change who they buy from, but has elected not to do those things. When an economic buying influence is elected to stay out of the decision, that person is still the economic buying influence, but the influence is much lower in the sale than other
So they
buying
still have
influences.
veto power, what you're saying.
Always have it. The fact that they lower themselves in degree of influence doesn't mean that they actually give up that power.
So now I've identified the buying influences for a particular sale, and I've identified that some buying influences, like a user buyer or a technical buyer, have a high degree of influence on the sale. How do I use that in my strategy?
I think it's important because if it's a complex sale with lots of buying influences, reality may be that you just don't have the time, energy, or resources to effectively cover and spend time with each of the 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 buying influences. Therefore, if you've done a good job through your own work and through coaching in identifying who has the highest degree of influence, not just one individual, but maybe the 5 or 6 highest degree of influence people in this particular sale for this particular sales objective, then that's where you would be concentrating your energy and the resources of your organization.
So we've talked about degree of influence and personal priority being one of those things that will cause a particular buying influence to have a lot of influence on a sale. There are some other factors that will impact the degree of influence. One of them is politics and protection of turf.
Yeah, I think that that's an important one, and it's often invisible to you as an outsider. But certainly someone who is hanging on or protecting an area of responsibility may exert huge influence as compared to other buying influences in the sale. And in order for you to be able to deal with that, you need excellent coaching. You need to really understand what are the politics and why would this particular area be so sensitive to one individual and relatively unimportant to another buying influence in the sale. If you have that understanding, then you can deal with it effectively. You know, what we found with experienced salespeople is, and of course, although we believe strategic selling is useful for anyone, we believe it's particularly useful for people with a great deal of experience. We feel the experienced sales professional knows how to handle almost any situation, knows how to talk to it, deal with it effectively if they're aware of it. And the importance here is being aware of it. And if you're unaware of the politics that are going on that could impact your sale, then you could do everything else right and still come out a loser.
It's amazing, too, how much political underwriting takes place in an organization. Who's on top? I want this, I don't want that person to gain this, or what have you.
I think somebody once said, and probably accurately, once you add a third person to an organization, you now have a political situation.
Another factor that does impact the degree of influence is the organizational impact. Where in the buying organization is your proposal likely to have the most immediate or lasting impact?
That's another area of investigation where coaching can be particularly helpful. Once you understand where that impact is going to take place, then you can begin to identify buying influences in that particular area who probably will be important buying influences and exert more influence in this particular selling situation simply because it's going to impact them directly more than it will other people.
There are two other factors that are involved. One is level of expertise, and obviously if a buying influence has a particular expertise in your product or service, then they might have a greater impact than someone who knows nothing about it. And the last one is really fairly simple. It's called location. I think a lot of times we overlook that. If I'm located in Reno, Nevada, and most of my buying influences are here, except for one who's in New York, that person may or may not have a high level of influence.
Well, that person may or may not. Furthermore, you are less likely to pay much attention to that person because they're not where you are.
So I need to understand their degree of influence on this particular sale and figure out a way to cover them or not.
Yeah, and I think that really goes further than you being in Reno and somebody being in New York. I think in this day and age, it may be several people involved in the sale are in Barcelona, and one is in Quebec, and two are in New York, and you're in Reno, Nevada, and now what do you do?
So far, Steve and I have discussed the prevalence of change in the business environment, why strategy is so important to the complex sale, why each single sales objective requires a separate strategy, and the first critical element in every good strategy, the identification of the four buying influences and their roles. We've defined the four buying influence roles, that of the economic buying influence, the user buying influence, the technical buying influence, and the coach, and we've stressed that identifying and covering all the individuals playing these four roles is a critical initial step in developing a strategy. We've also talked about how important it is to understand the degree of influence that each one of these buying influences has on a sale. Understanding your buying influences is the first step of a strategy. The second step is assessing what we call red flags. We turn to that second step next. Steve and I have discussed the first element in Miller Heiman's strategic selling process, buying influences. There are